Right, so welcome to the second discussion for Utopia, where we're going to be discussing about North Korea. It's a topic that I wouldn't say necessarily it's near and dear to my heart, but it's one that is very personal in the sense that my parents came from South Korea, and also my fellow presenter, June, is also from Korea, South Korea as well. So this is an issue where we sort of have a much more of a personal insight into, and we're more than happy to sort of share what we know about the ongoing situation in North Korea, as well as some of the details that are often not covered in the media. All right, so with that, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, and present. And all right, so welcome to Inside North Korea. The first part of this presentation is going to be covered by Jun, and the remainder of the presentation, where I'll be covering a wide variety of facets about North Korea, will be covered by me. So without further ado, Jun, can you go ahead and start the presentation?
Yes. So welcome to North Korea. First, I'm just going to go over the quick history of North Korea. This is a timeline that I put in just to help you guys visualize all the big events that happened, but I'll be going into a little bit more depth in the next slide. So our history lesson begins at 1944 when World War II happened and there was a Japanese invasion. So something a little personal in here. My grandparents experienced like the Japanese invasion too. So basically what happened, Japan like invaded Korea, everyone was forced to learn Japanese, a lot of violence, things like that. But in 1945, Japan surrenders because the US bombs Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then the 38th parallel line, which is the middle line between North and South Korea, forms. After that, the USSR and the US Cold War happens, which is when they had a disagreement on whether they should elect the ruler through elections or not. So after a year, the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea forms. And this basically means that there were two different identities now instead of an entire Korea. After 2 years, the Korean War happens. And this GIF over here, the first one with the Korean map, is basically how the Korean War happened. So as you can see, it's gonna come up, but North Korea almost invaded the entirety of South Korea, but with the help of the UN, South Korea fights back. And after a bit of quarreling at the 38th parallel, they decided to settle a non-aggression pact in 1953 because so many people were dying and they just figured it wasn't worth it anymore. So after that, North Korea starts to develop their industry, and also they start to develop their weapons, and their agriculture and industrial revolution became so big so that they became the second biggest agricultural country in Asia after Japan, which is very impressive. But after a few decades, the fall of USSR and the Reformation in China happens, and North Korea loses a lot of support. So as they feel threatened, the arms race accelerated and they started to try and build more weapons. In 1994, there came the North Korean famine, and a lot of people died, obviously, from the famine. And North Korea actually reached out to the world for help, and the world did help them. South Korea even gave them food to eat, and I believe the UN also helped them. And in 2002, the first nuclear test began, and that's where it started. And in 2011, Kim Jong-il dies, which is the second dictator from all the names. If I don't know if you guys remember, but we had that quiz problem. This was the second, and he died, and Kim Jong-un became the dictator, who is the current dictator. And in 2018, this is a bit more recent, there was the Winter Olympics. And this was a chance for South and North Korea to talk about their relationship. And they actually participated as a Korean contingent. And they had a flag with the entire South Korea, not South Korea, the entire Korea map. Like, it was very historic. And also, as you guys probably know, Trump had a relationship with Kim Jong-un where they met and they sent each other letters. And also the Korean president, the GIF over there, the Korean president is basically going over to North Korea and they hug, they shake hands, looks all great. 2020, which is pretty recent, there was the explosion of the Inter-Korean Liaison Office, which is the GIF on the very bottom. And what North Korea did was that they publicly blew up 2 buildings that were meant to be like a unionized building where North and South Korea talks. And I shouldn't be laughing. I just, it was like this was also a very historic moment because just the relationship between North and South Korea has always been good and then bad, good and then bad. And this is an example of 2018 and 2020, just showing that dynamic. But that is it for the history.
All right, do you guys have any questions on this slide that Jun just presented?
Yeah, I do. So why is that when Japan surrendered and Korea being divided by 2 parts? That part I'm not clear.
Right,
Yeah.
because if you, Jun, do you
Oh,
want to go ahead and explain? Okay, I'll explain. So I'll give my own bit on this subject. So if you think about World War II, who was on the side of victory, right? Among those victors was the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And sort of what happened there was that they were temporarily in alliance with each other in order to fight against the Axis power in World War II. But after World War II was over, the matter of who had control over the Korean Peninsula was up for debates because the Soviet Union, with sort of its communist sphere of influence, wanted the Korean Peninsula to be on their side. Likewise, for the United States of America, they wanted to see South Korea to not turn over to the communist side, but rather be a capitalist democratic nation, much akin to theirs. And so what ended up happening was the decision amongst Koreans themselves had to be whether they were going to side on the side of the Soviet Union or the side of the United States. And sort of where the divide eventually occurred was at the northern part, which you guys can tell is also geographically located closer to the Soviet Union, was more akin to alliance themselves with the Soviet Union, partly because they have received a lot of support, a lot of resources, and even refuge during dangerous times. And so the North Korean government at the time, with Kim Il-sung, they were very supportive of having the communist ideology sort of being the de facto ideology that was going to rule the Korean Peninsula. Meanwhile, in the South, there was a lot of advocates for having a more democratic representative government, unlike the sort of government in the North. And so that's where the sort of divide occurred. And eventually in 1950, so 2 years after the 2 entities were sort of declared as separate entities, the North invaded the South in order to reclaim the entire Korean Peninsula under one nation, right? And that's where the United States, under the UN banter, intervened before North Korea could successfully take over all of North Korea. And that's how sort of the pushback back and forth created the 38th parallel line that you see today. So that's like a brief summary, and it doesn't go into all of the important details, but that's sort of the quick summary.
I see. So when Japan was occupy Korea, which part, like Soviet Union or the US, actually helped them to kick the Japanese out of their territory? Or they both have the hands in?
Okay, so Japan sort of after the war, they automatically gave over the reins of control back to the Korean people right after World War II, because that was sort of the promise that Japan had agreed to um,
Oh,
in exchange for the end of the war. And so that's why there was a sense of limited autonomy that was in Korea for a brief period of time before eventually they started to settle in their respective political camps. And um, let's see. Yeah, so it's not like the US had to fight Japan directly on Korean soil for the Japanese to leave, but sort of the Japanese left the Korean peninsula entirely after World War II as part of the agreed promise. So there wasn't like any sort of prolonged conflict or battles that
I
took
see.
place. Yeah, it was sort of like this transition of power.
I see. So even before the Japanese invasion, you guys didn't have any colonialism that happened in Korea?
That's a good question. And actually, I'm gonna get to that in the later part of the slide.
Okay, okay.
Unless Jude, do you have something else that you wanted to add? June, are you there?
I actually have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Isha.
Yeah, so you said that the USSR and US Cold War affected Korea. Are they like capitalist or socialist or communist, or what does their economy look like?
In what term here? So are you talking about Korea right after World War II?
I guess both. You can kind of walk me through it, I guess. Like, what about contemporary times and
Oh yeah, okay. So we can talk about contemporary. So North Korea right now, you can consider to be as close as you're ever going to get to sort of a perfect communist government, where sort of all the enterprises are controlled by the state, and all of the employment, the allocation of resources, they're all determined by an economic plan that is passed by the government or the Korean Workers' Party in North Korea. And so there's a very heavy state controlled aspect of North Korea. And in like comparison to countries like China, for example, North Korea is far more what you might call the ideal communist nation, where they actually try to uphold many of the principles. Meanwhile, in South Korea, could you, who was that?
Oh, I'm just like, it's not ideal communist.
Oh, not
I don't
not
think
like ideal, but like as close as you're gonna get to like the
pure, yeah,
the
pure
communist type,
communist country,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, like a pure communist country. And then obviously you guys can tell by the fact that I'm here in the United States. South Korea has turned towards the opposite political track, where they at first started off with their own series of dictatorships. So they try to have like a democratic government, but oftentimes what you see in weak states is that the fight over power or determining who has the power to govern the people, that sort of for the first part was sort of determined by the military. And so you're going to see a lot of military dictators in the very beginnings of Korean history, South Korean history, and only later on in 1987 was there the first democratically elected president in South Korea. So there was a transition in the South too, but that's how you can sort of think about the different political governments that exist between the two countries.
John, I was nodding, but I guess you can't see me, so I am here, and I said all good.
Okay, all right. Yeah, if there's no more questions, I'm gonna go on to my part of the slide. So with that, okay, so the reason why I labeled this next part of the slide as Kim is not because of some sort of bias that I have of wanting my last name to be a religion, name of a religion in the future or anything like that, but sort of because Kimism is, in a sense, the de facto religion in North Korea. And so you're going to see that in North Korea, contrary to what the Western media might portray to me, it is a very complex, intricate network of different ideologies, of different rules, of structures that are all coexisting together in order to form this sort of religion, in a sense that's very akin to traditional religion. So that's why I labeled this part of the slides as Kimism. And before I get too serious about the presentations, I just wanted to let you guys know that sort of the information that you get from K-dramas, not that I watch K-dramas or anything like that, but sort of the historical narratives that are portrayed in K-dramas are not quite factual. So the information that we're going to be presenting in this presentation is going to be far more factual. And for those who are curious to know, the one on the left here is a drama called Crash Landing on You. It's the one where a South Korean woman crash lands on North Korea. I don't know the whole narrative behind it, obviously, because I only watched the first episode and I got bored of it pretty quickly. On the one on the right here was a drama that I actually watched halfway through, which is pretty much a miracle because I usually don't finish K-dramas. But this one's called Mr. Sunshine, and this is sort of the Japanese, if you guys want to sort of have a very general understanding of what life was like under Japanese imperialism in South Korea. This is sort of a drama where you can sort of watch. But then again, these aren't like 100% factual dramas, so make sure you guys keep that in the back of your minds. Monarchy. So to answer, I believe it was Ant's question or maybe Isha's question. South Korea, before the Japanese imperialists took over the Korean Peninsula, was like many other East Asian nations or nations all over the world, in that we had a monarchy system in place for much of actually Korean history, in which we had a monarch that was succeeded by their heirs, such as their sons. And that sort of tradition carried on much until actually when Japan first not invaded the Korean Peninsula, but actually occupied the Korean Peninsula. So the sort of misconception that people seem to have, or not the misconception, but the lack of knowledge that most people seem to have, was that Japan just simply annexed Korea in 1910, which is not true at all, because Japan was actually in the Korean Peninsula, I think since beginning of the later half of the 19th century. So they were actually around there for a while. And sort of the relationship between the Japanese government officials and the Korean government at the time was one sort of where it was not quite peaceful coexistence, but it's the one where we sort of agree that you guys have your autonomy and you guys have your own autonomy, and they sort of allowed the Korean government to continue to rule as it is. So the image that you guys see here on the left here is actually the first king, or the last king of the Joseon dynasty, and the first emperor of Korea, called Emperor, and his name was Emperor Kojong, who's ruled from 1897 to 1907. And actually, he was abdicated from his power by, at that time, the Japanese provisional government, who decided that they wanted to place Emperor Sunjong, who was Emperor Kojong's son, as the new to put him into the seat of power, primarily because of the fact that Emperor Sunjong was much more easier to control than his father. And I think there's someone here in the chat. Let's see, Steel Rain is pretty good. Steel Rain, can you describe what Steel Rain is about, Kevin?
It's just a movie that I recommend to watch.
Oh, what's it about though?
It's basically about like the top North Korean and South Korean leader are gonna like hold a meeting like in the border area, and but I didn't remember clearly, but it's like a North Korean sniper, like a hitman. Like he's gonna kill the no, it's a I couldn't remember the plot, but it's pretty good.
I feel like I heard that before. Is there like Steel Rain 2? I think Steel Rain 2 came out recently. I don't remember.
I only watched one. I heard 2 is not as good as 1, but 1 is really good.
Okay, I think I heard about the movie then. I'll personally recommend to everyone who's currently watching right now to go ahead and watch Steel Rain, and then the movie is terrible. You can blame Kevin for recommending you a good or a bad movie. So yeah, so watch Steel Rain when you guys have time. Yeah. Actually, that's all I wanted to. This is sort of the basic summary of what I wanted to discuss about, is the fact that the monarchy was actually fairly recent. Actually occurred fairly recently into Korean history, and you're going to see how this plays a very important dynamic in sort of the transitioning from sort of the traditional monarchy system in the Korean peninsula as a whole to sort of what you see in North Korea today, where you have something called the Kim dynasty, right? Where you sort of see the hereditary transfer of power between father and son, as it was between Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. And that to the Korean people is not something that's strange or out of the box, simply because of this historical precedent that was already in place, where we had a monarchy, dynastical form of ruling power in the Korean peninsula. So you can see why there was a sort of a smooth transition in North Korea to sort of have a similar phenomenon going around, where sort of the Kim leaders are often perceived as the emperors or the kings of the Korean ruler, and they are properly in power because of some sort of divine right. So any questions about Emperor Kojong and Emperor Sunjong? All right, I had a feeling you guys didn't have any questions about all the Korean men. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So like how I described earlier, in sort of this relationship that plays between sort of the Korean monarchy and the current sort of dynasty system in North Korea, is this worshiping phenomenon, where in the picture to the right, you see here, North Koreans are actually expected on a, I forgot what the frequency was, but I think it was a nearly daily basis, where they have to visit the statues, the 10 feet tall bronze statues of Kim Il-sung to the left and Kim Jong-il to the right, and offer offerings to them in the form of flowers mostly. And you guys will probably be able to see videos where North Koreans actually sort of pay their respects to the deceased leaders of North Korea. And sort of why I decided to include this slide into the presentation was sort of because of the correlation to Sejongdaewang, or Kin Sejong, which you can visit in South Korea in Seoul, where King Sejong was actually known for inventing the Korean alphabet, also known as Hangul, which was often perceived as the great equalizer between the peasants and the ruling elites in Korea, and being able to create a sort of nationwide language that was easy to learn, to read, and to write. And so this sort of interplay of how the North Korean people are expected to sort of treat their leaders as some sort of gods or divine beings is sort of a pattern that you're going to see continuously throughout the presentation. So Korean culture. So if you think about Korean culture and many East Asian cultures in general, there's a heavy influence of Confucianism and Buddhism, and that there's a very strong emphasis on family relationships and building a social harmony and placing the community over the individual, which is very contrary against the sort of individualism that you see in the United States or in Western Europe, where sort of the individual presides over the well-being and the welfare of the community. And Korean culture has sort of made it easier, in a sense, for North Korea to have their people be sort of obedient, to be subservient to the ruling leaders. And this can be both a good and a bad thing, in the sense that it's good in that it could make sure order and peace and harmony is well contained in society, and that law and order always prevails. But it can be bad in the sense that depending on who is in power and who is in charge of the government, that can play a very sort of a lack of mechanism that can regulate the sort of power and the control that the ruling elites have over the people. And this is something that you see often in North Korea, where they treat Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leaders, with a sense of the form of respect and obedience that you would normally sort of give to your parents or to your grandparents. And that's something that's very common in Korean culture, and that's something that is played more broadly in North Korea as a whole. So culture is an important part. So let me actually go to the back slide. Right now, everything that I've covered so far, I've described them in order to get into your guys' minds that the system in North Korea didn't just happen magically overnight, right? This is history being in play over generations of development of Korean culture, of the various different sort of the government evolution in North Korea is sort of influenced by the culture and the existing history and the monarchy that was in place in Korean society. And then let's see, it seems like leader worshiping practice sounds like Stalinism. So, and that's actually a good point, because when I was researching about North Korea, there was a lot of various different influences at play. Obviously, since North Korea claims itself to be a communist state, the principles of communism plays a very integral role in sort of how North Korea determines how their people are going to be ruled moving forwards. And also Stalinism, like leader worshiping practice, as you just mentioned, is also something that can be a term to ascribe to the North Korean regime. So Buddhism, Confucianism, Stalinism, communism, and Korean culture in general, they sort of play an integral role in shaping North Korea into what it is today. So let's say Isha asked the question, what about certain people in the United States who seem to worship politicians? I think that can be said about a lot of radical movements.
I would say like the leader worshiping thing. The politicians themselves usually promoting nationalism to the extreme, to its extreme forms. They don't really worship the leader, but the thing is the sense of being belong to a nation, like extreme nationalism form, also result of it. It's not about the leader is like doing like a figure of perfect, like worship them like God, but the feeling that that politician make you feel, like feeling nationalist, feeling like you belong to a group of people, like the elite, and not, like will point out a common enemy, like somewhere. It is similar to fascist, like Hitler, the way he become a politic figure and promoting the nationalism, so-called.
Actually, before I say something, Isha, did you wanted to respond to that really quickly? Isha, is your mic muted?
Still a little bit excessive in, I think that when a politician themselves is worshipped to any well, try really, but when it comes down to it, when people start to worship the leaders that represent policy rather than policy itself, then I think that can get a little reminiscent of each other. And I think that both systems, like the American political system and the North Korean political system, can also be reminiscent of each other in that aspect, that people start to worship one political party more than the other, or they just start to say, oh, this political party is the right thing and that's it, and I like this politician and that's it. It's kind of, I feel like it's very partisan.
You bring up a pretty good point, and sort of what you touched on more broadly is sort of human nature and human tendency to sort of idolize or worship a being or a certain entity. And then that's sort of in our natural psychology, and sort of being and sort of having a natural tendency to sort of exhibit those sorts of behaviors and those sorts of ways of thinking. And that sort of manifests itself even in countries of outside of North Korea, like United States, where you just mentioned, where you have lifelong Republicans or lifelong Democrats. But I think the important fundamental difference that you need to have between comparing politicians in the United States and the leaders of North Korea, although albeit very similar in many of the aspects that you just described, is whether or not the people living in those nations actually have the freedom to sort of be able to realize sort of the wrongs and the ways of the thinkings, and being able to retract from that. I think that's a very crucial differentiation that we need to make. And that while on one side, you may be in the moment sort of worshiping and following whatever in sort of like a cult-like fashion, following whatever the words of the leader that you're supporting, But on the other side, in North Korea, you really don't have an option, or you don't really necessarily have the free will to sort of escape that bubble and being able to look at the broader world as a whole and being able to realize sort of the faults in your ways of thinking. Albeit on both sides, there are always going to be people who, until the day they die, they're going to think a certain way or think in a certain manner. But sort of that freedom and the liberty and speech and thoughts, that sort of makes a crucial differentiation. And I'm going to touch upon that later in the slides, where North Korea, the reason why they've been able to stay in power for so long was because they have such strong control over the press and the media, that North Korea is the only world that they've ever known. And that's something that's going to stay with them for the rest of their lives. So I think that's something that I would comment on, sort of the differentiation characters. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, it definitely did. And I actually agree with a lot of the points that you made. Obviously, we're not the same as North Korea. Every nation has different ways of distributing political power. And I think that there are faults in both systems. And I do think that people do innately choose one side over another, or tend to flock towards certain movements if they find them to match their own preferences. But I think the problem with that is that you end up appreciating that you do in a group. So like even let's say that there's a conservative Christian who values a pro-life approach on abortion, but doesn't necessarily care about immigration policy. They'll end up supporting a lot of anti-immigration policy just because that's the stance of the rest of their party, right? So I think that support goes both ways, and I feel like if you're extreme on one certain issue, then you tend to go towards that type of ideology for the rest of your political choices. And I think that that might be a little bit destructive for people who aren't completely well versed in politics, or just are not able to see the full picture.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for the most part, when the outside world sort of looks at North Korea, they sort of make fun of them, like, oh, you guys don't have any free will, you guys don't have any free speech or free thought. But just as you mentioned, Isha, we're in a sense not that much different. We ourselves like to believe we have free will to a certain extent, but sort of the environment and the culture in which we grow up in shapes so much of our thoughts and our actions that do we, in any sense, can be comparable to North Koreans in terms of free will. So I think that's a good point you bring up. All right, so I'm going to go on to the rest of the presentation because there's still a lot to cover. Common enemy. So you're going to see this, and this isn't just an isolated phenomenon in North Korea, but this is something that's happening on a global scale, where every nation needs to sort of needs to dictate a certain common enemy in order to be able to bring forth a sense of nationalism and a unity amongst the people living within their country. And I think there's someone in the chat room right now, Democracy is myth. Okay, thank you, Anne, for the comment. Anyways, so speaking about the common enemy, from reading sort of literature on North Korea, sort of what I noticed was sort of the changing trend that happened in North Korea was this trend from sort of demonizing the Japanese in North Korea as a way of sort of unifying the Korean people. That sort of changed after the Korean War, where it was sort of no longer the Japanese that was sort of the primary target for much of the rhetoric and the propaganda behind North Korea, but rather now it's the United States, the Americans. So if you really wanted to understand how this was possible in the first place, you have to think about the event that happened in between, World War II. So after World War II, Japan was no longer the power that it was formerly of. In fact, it was stripped of much of the power in terms of military might that it once had. And so North Korea, when it sort of needs to think about, and you guys can sort of put yourselves in the shoes of North Korean leaders, as appalling as that may sound for some of you all, if you really wanted to sort of have a rallying call for your people, you want to be able to have a common enemy that is tangible and also threatening in a sense. After World War II, Japan was no longer sort of the ideal sort of scapegoat or the target for what North Korean could utilize in order to build the sort of dictatorship that it had today. That changed during the Korean War, where sort of what the United States textbooks don't necessarily cover is the amount of bombing and the shootings that took place in the Korean Peninsula, where Koreans from both sides, where millions of Koreans actually on both sides were killed due to the Korean War. And you guys might say the positive effects of the Korean War and the American involvement outweighs whatever casualties were incurred during this period. But for the North Koreans, it's sort of this perfect opportunity to now be able to change the focus from the Japanese imperialists to the American soldiers who sort of attacked and, in their words, ravaged and divided the Korean people amongst themselves. And so, despite the fact that the Soviet Union also helped them, they sort of discard that, obviously, because that doesn't suit along with their rhetoric. But now they have a more tangible opponent in the form of the United States. And that's why the North Korean has much of the rhetoric aimed at the United States as it does today. I think, let's see, I agree. Okay. Thank you, Anna and Kevin, for the great democracy comments. I really appreciate your guys' insight on just how much democracy is or is not a myth. All right, so next slide. This is probably the most important, if not the sort of primary contributing factor to Kimism. And yes, I will continue to use Kimism despite the fact that it's not an actual official term. I think Kimism perfectly describes exactly how the situation that's being played in North Korea is very much sort of like a religion in its own sense. And say the next slide, Juche. So, okay, for the time being, no, actually not for the time being. Does anybody know what Juche means?
Independent government, like self-reliant government, right?
And you're shocking me. Wow. And you even answered before June too, which is even more surprising. So actually you've got about 75% of the answer correct. I was wondering maybe June, you can give the sort of direct translation. June, are you there? Juche.
Juche?
It's okay if you don't know, I won't make fun of you.
I know what it means. I don't know how to explain it.
Juche is self-reliance. That's probably the easiest way you can think about that. And what Anne just actually covered was 2 out of the 4 main principles of Juche. That's sort of the underlying driver behind North Korea. So Juche has 4 parts, and let me see if I can remember it off the top of my head. Autonomy and ideology, independence in politics, self-sufficiency in economy, self-reliance in economy, and self-sufficiency in military. Actually, the 2 might be switched up, but those are the 4 main principles of Juche. And the reason why Juche is so important is because, in a sense, it's very akin to sort of Judeo-Christianity. I think sort of the unspoken history about North Korea and the origins of North Korea is that Kim Il-sung actually grew up in a Christian household. This is actually surprising to me as well, in the fact that Kim Il-sung probably derived much of his regime and the structure of his government to sort of fall akin to how Judeo-Christianity sort of works around Jesus Christ, and who is the savior of our sins, and also in biblical stories such as Noah's Ark, where you can see that God sent upon, I think it was like 40 years of rain, I'm not sure, 40 rains onto the earth to sort of punish the sinful human beings and wrongdoings of humankind, and how Noah and his family, as well as I think pairs of animals, were the only survivors, were the only chosen survivors of the flood. And sort of why I included Judeo-Christianity was sort of how the Kim leaders are so portrayed similarly to how Jesus Christ and also God is portrayed in the Christian religion. In that sort of the let's see if I can think of a better way of explaining this. Let's see, suffering. if you know anything about Christianity, you're going to realize that suffering is a major theme, and that a lot of the obstacles and the hurdles you have to overcome through in life, uh, suffering, for example, they are sent, in the Bible, they mention this. The suffering are actually sent directly from God in order to strengthen you and in order to test your resolve against temptation and against your ability to sort of overcome hardships. And you're going to see that this phenomenon, and I'm actually going to go to the next slide really quickly, plays really well in 고난의 행군, or the Arduous March, which played in 1994 to 1998. June actually briefly described this in her timeline, how there was a famine in North Korea. And actually how this famine sort of took place was, there was the natural elements. For example, I think there was the flood and the drought that sort of led to the decline in the yield of crops of North Koreans, but also the fall of the USSR, and how the fall of the USSR, which was a very important ally to North Korea in terms of food imports, sort of caused a massive food shortage in North Korea, where mass starvation took place in the nation. In most other situations, if a country experienced sort of this mass starvation, like think about the United States so far, there will be mass hysteria, there will be protests, there will be rebellions, there might be even a military coup to overthrow the government. But how did the North Korean regime handle this? The image to the right here sort of conveys it into the image, where Kim Il-sung, which is often portrayed as the Jesus Christ equivalent in North Korea, overcome these hardships and the sufferings to quote unquote liberate his people against the Japanese imperialist forces. And likewise, this period of suffering and this hunger and the famine that you're going through is part of the movement, or you are part of the movement where North Korea is fighting every single day in order for a better future for the Korean people, and how the suffering that you're actually undergoing right now sort of pales in comparison to what you're actually doing for the state as abroad. And so this sort of change, or the shift in mentality in the way that North Koreans perceive sort of an economic financial crisis to be one of opportunity to strengthen the rhetoric and the propaganda of the North Korean regime, that I don't know what other word to explain as, but it's a brilliant strategic move. And I think this is sort of something that North Korea is underappreciated for, in a very negative sense, of course, in being able to sway the minds of their people in the way that they're doing. And of course, in the cultural, the ideological, and the historical viewpoints that I've described previously. And before I talk about the North Korean education system, do you guys have any questions so far? And actually, my voice is hurting really badly right now, so if you guys have any questions, speak up right now.
Just to correct something, it was 40 days of rain, not 40 years.
Oh, 40 days?
Yep.
Yeah, I was gonna say 40 years. Sounds like hell to me, but 40 days, yeah. If June is much more of a biblical expert than I am, so 40 days, yeah, instead of 40 years.
Yeah, I can see like why North Korea is not in favor for like the southern people, because of this extreme. Actually, I don't know, this extreme leadership. This was just too extreme. Like coming from like the same communism system like Vietnam. So yeah, we don't promote this extreme ideology that you portray your leader as God like this. It's just too much.
Right.
Yeah. I actually really wanted to talk about how similar it is in like, the Korean War to the Vietnam War. At first, I didn't know, but I feel like, we are in the same proxy war between like the two ideology of the communism and the US, in the West. But I can see the nuance in the Korean War is that the ideology and the leadership is so different. It's completely different from like a communist regime in Vietnam. It's so different in terms of how people portray leadership, and yeah, Simon. Yeah, I talk more about this later.
I feel like this is like theocracy. It's not even a communist state. It's just
Right.
theocracy.
Yeah, this itself isn't communism or what communism is trying to
Yeah,
strive
it's a
for.
dictatorship. Dictatorship, I would say.
This is more like a monarchy combined with theology. Yeah, so the
Yeah.
combination of the two. All right, I think my voice recovered a bit, so I'll continue. Okay, I think it's best to start out this way. There's 22 million people in North Korea, all right? Out of those millions of people, the probability that at least one North Korean or an individual will have at least some ability to sort of doubt the world or the reality in which that they're living in. So how does North Korean sort of deal with these sorts of potential situations where a rebellion or revolt might actually happen in their nation? And sort of contrary to what most people might believe, there has been actually not too many, but there has been a couple of revolts that happened in North Korea that were immediately suppressed by the North Korean government. But sort of the more effective way of handling it is through the education system. The image to the left here is sort of the way that the education system in North Korea wants to make sure that their people are trying to portray their leader as, this friendly, lovely, happy-looking leaders who are sort of hugging and holding the children of the nation as sort of a way to portray them under this light of friendliness, of sort of the way that they care for and they look after the people in this country. And on the image to the right here is the real life actual snapshot of what a North Korean classroom actually looks like. The uniform is actually something that's common in both North and South Korea, and that students are expected to wear uniforms. But sort of the interesting point that you can see here, and I'm not sure if you can see my mouse cursor, are the portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un that are hanged at the very front of the classrooms. And this is sort of a way as to remind North Korean students on a day-to-day basis, these are the people that you're expected to look up to. The reason why you're going through the whole education system is in order to promote and forward the mission of North Korea and to be loyal and faithful to the leaders, which is very similar to the Judeo-Christianity doctrine of being loyal and faithful to Jesus Christ and to God. And so this sort of correlation between the two, you can see here starting from a very early age where North Koreans are sort of trained under this education system.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, go ahead.
Fun fact, North Koreans are taught that these leaders don't have a butthole.
Yeah, they don't go to the bathroom.
Yeah,
Really?
they just,
Why?
they don't have a butthole.
They're perfect. They're deities. They're gods.
Yeah. That's the fun fact right there.
Yeah, so that's a big contrast between your typical dictatorship and my leader doesn't have a butthole or goes to the restroom dictatorship. So that's a contrast you're going to see. And in fact, most of the education in North Korea, sort of from my readings, was whether you're learning mathematics or science or history or literature, all of it in a way goes back to the heroic stories of North Korea. It's like, say you're like counting apples, for example, like one apple plus another apple equals two apples. Like how many apples did Kim Il-sung, if Kim Il-sung ate one apple and Kim Jong-il ate another apple, how many apples in total they eat? So that's sort of like the North Korean education system, or that's how they sort of educate their students. So that's sort of this training or this reinforcement constantly reoccurs throughout that this theme constantly reoccurs throughout North Korean's education system. So that's a little fun.
When I was in primary school, I also like had to wear that red scarf.
Oh, could you explain what the red scarf stands for?
I don't know how to translate it to English, but it's like some maybe Anne knows how to
Yeah, I also have the red scarf and like a uniform with the red, and I also have a hat, a little small hat when you have to wear it when you go into the assembly, like, and singing, assembly, you sing the national anthem, you will have to wear a like particular way, you have to dress in a particular way when you sing songs. And the red scarf meaning is like the blood of the country. No, in Vietnam, they represent the bloodshed that have been, the blood that of the people that have been shed. So for the trade of peace, for the trade of an independent Vietnam. Yeah, something like that. And you will always have to remember it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I found reading this is really annoying, and like, that's something I dislike about like China, and I think it's just
Yeah.
this is pure formalism, and yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but
Yeah.
like in China we don't have like the the portrait of either Mao Zedong or other leaders on the wall. We have our national flag. I think that's a a good point. Like, don't promote really
So
Yeah.
worship.
in Vietnam, we have, Ho Chi Minh. We have pictures of Ho Chi Minh up in the wall for every classroom. Yeah, every classroom will be in the same structure. Like you have to put up the leader's portrait, and then there's 5 lessons that he taught you. Like they have
Oh yeah.
they have 5 lessons that Ho Chi Minh taught you is printed in the wall, and then every morning you will have to read it. Like 5 rules, 5 whatever, 5 lessons. You have to read it every morning. That's how my education system works. It's pretty extreme. It's pretty similar. Honestly speaking, really similar to this. Like we also have portrait of the leader having children around, and then yeah, we sing songs about leaders every Monday morning. Yeah, and yeah, pretty similar to this. But the leader, like Ho Chi Minh, is a much better guy than Kim. That I will say. Yeah.
Without any bias, of course, in saying that.
Oh yes, of course. But from my perspective, my leader is better than Kim.
But I guess
Kim leader.
Ho Chi Minh is a national hero, right?
Huh?
Yeah, I think Ho Chi Minh is a national leader, right? A national hero. I mean.
Yes. The thing about Ho Chi Minh is that he used communism to release Vietnam from colonialism from the French. Yeah. So like the purpose of the Communist Party in Vietnam is so much more like is about the nation. They care about the independence of the state. They don't care about who power. Like the Communist Party in Vietnam, they so they don't really have the desire to be a dictator. They just wanted to bring independence form for Vietnam, because during the war, before the Vietnam War, we under Japanese imperialism and French colonialism, and Communist Party in Vietnamese Communist Party, actually the people who won all the wars against this colonialism and imperialists. So they have a reason to they have a reason to unite, like really good reason to unite North and South of Vietnam. Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna briefly interrupt you there. I think what you just described right now is sort of the major difference between how Vietnam turned out and how North Korea turned out. North Korea, at its very beginning, was much the same. They talked about their efforts and their war efforts as part of this general scheme in order to unify and free the Korean Peninsula from foreign adversaries. Right? I think that thing was similar. I think where the diversion occurs is that the Kim Party, right, the Korean Workers' Party, which is what it's called now, sort of realized that, hey, there's an opportunity for us to consolidate power, right? And sort of what happened was that it began from a very, moralistic goal of independence into something where, we can actually use this opportunity to, gain total control over the state under the name of independence and freedom of the Korean Peninsula. And they started persecuting, I think, pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese officials within their government to only have officials in the government that are loyal to the North Korean state. right? And that's sort of where the diversion occurs between Vietnam and North Korea. And I think Vietnam recently had a parliamentary election. I'm not sure, but I think you guys had a recent election where you guys elected your prime minister, whatever he's called. Okay, so it's already 6:03, so I'm gonna proceed through the rest of the slides really quickly because the best part is actually still in store, believe it or not, because I have been actually investigating a little bit and sort of giving my, analysis about what's going on in contemporary North Korea. So let's see. Yeah, as usual, if it's 6:10 and you guys want to go ahead and leave, feel free to do so. But I feel like today's meeting is going to run a little over 6:10. So if you guys want to stay for the best part, which is going to be at the end, then please do bear with us and stay with the rest of the slide. So I'm going to play this really brief 1-minute clip. This is sort of like a real life footage into sort of a very realistic but also choreographed sort of scene where Kim Jong-un is giving a speech. I forgot what events this may have been for the October military parade that happened last year. Oh, I think my PowerPoint just crashed. So apparently if I play a video, my PowerPoint crashes. Jun, can you actually share your screen now? Let's see, let me stop sharing.
Okay.
Yeah, if you can share your screen. And then, okay, unfortunately, I won't be able to play clips of Kim Jong-un speaking, which I know you guys were all looking forward to seeing and sort of hearing how he sounds like, but my computer only has 8 gigs of RAM, so it just crashes every time Zoom comes up. And then if you can give me remote access, let's see. I think if you go into remote control at the very top tab.
Can you see my screen though?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Here we go.
Okay. All right, so let's see.
방역전선과 자연재해복구전선에서 우리 인민군 장병들이 발휘한 애국적이고 영웅적인 헌신은 누구든 감사의 눈물 없이는 대할 수 없는 것들입니다. 조선노동당 중앙위원회를 대표하여 오늘의 10월 명절을 크나큰 평양행을 택하지 않고 스스로들 또 다른 피해 복구 지역으로 발걸음들을 옮긴 애국자들, 우리 당이 걸어온 영광 넘친 75년사를 갈피갈피 돌이켜보는 이 시각, 오늘 이 자리에 서면 무슨 말부터 할까 많이 생각도 해보았지만 진정 우리 인민들에게 터놓고 싶은 마음속 고백, 마음속 진정은 고맙습니다 이 한마디뿐입니다.
Okay, so even though I'm fluent in Korean, North Korean accent is still hard for me to understand. So it's difficult for me to give a direct translation. Jin, you can go ahead to the next slide. To sort of answer Anne's question, what was he saying? I think the background context, because I tried to watch as much of the clip as possible, not because I wanted to, but because I had to do it for you guys, obviously, was because the North Koreans' collaborative effort in order to sort of combat against COVID-19. Because COVID-19, even though North Korea is pretty closed off to the rest of the world, there was COVID-19 cases in the country, and sort of Kim Jong-un's speech was to commemorate on his people's valiant efforts and their work in order to sort of contain the pandemic, as well as more broadly, sort of the work that they're doing for the North Korean state as a whole. And Jun, did you want to add something?
Yeah. Also, North Korea claimed that they didn't have any cases, but like they would close down all the schools despite having no cases, and like close down all the stores. So that's just the fun fact.
Yep, it checks out. Everything checks out.
Yep.
Okay, a beautiful chess game. This third part is actually, I would say, the most important part that you're going to get away from the presentation today. And the cycle of how North Korea has been able to survive until the modern day age was actually because they know how to play global affairs in a chess-like fashion. So Pyeongchang Winter Olympics in 2018, you guys probably remember having watched the Winter Olympics that took place in South Korea. Pyeongchang Winter Olympics wasn't just, an event, a normal, a very special event for all Koreans, obviously. But for the North Koreans, this was a very important opportunity. And I had to actually watch a lot of South Korean analysts to sort of get this insight. But this figure that you see here, this woman figure in the very center of this image, that's Kim Yo-jong. That's Kim Jong-un's younger sister. Her being here is very significant because since the end of the Korean War, no member of North Korea's ruling family has set foot in South Korea until the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. Now, you guys might be thinking, oh, this is like an extension of a branch of an olive branch, or this is a sign of peace. This is a willingness for Koreans to come together in an international event like the Olympics. But this has more underlying significance than might appear on the surface. And this is actually President Moon Jae-in. This is the white jacket figure here, shaking hands with Kim Yo-jong. That's actually President Moon Jae-in. And sort of the background context that I wanted to give you guys was the past two presidents of South Korea were both from the Conservative Party, the Bosudan. The Conservative Party in Korea are known for being hardliners against, or being hardliners in North Korean policies. So this is very much the get rid of your nuclear weapons, or we're not going to have any negotiations or talks with you sort of approach. President Moon Jae-in is sort of different. He's from the Democratic equivalent in the United States, or the Liberal Party in South Korea, where he was elected after President Park Geun-hye, after she was impeached and convicted of embezzlement charges, of her negligence in the Seoul ferry accident. And so this paved the way for a Democratic president to sort of take power in South Korea. And his approach to sort of North Korea was, hey, let's have peace, let's have talk, The fact that Kim Yo-jong came to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, President Moon probably perceived it as an extension of the branch of the olive branch. But as you guys will soon quickly figure out, let's see, let me go back a slide. This was actually done in order for a much more bigger picture, and I'll explain what the bigger picture is. But yeah, it is sort of like a kind of dangerous occupation. But luckily, I think South Korean presidents only get one term, so they're not in threat of danger for too long. But
like the current president, South Korean president.
President Moon Jae-in, yeah, for his sort of like pro peace with North Korea.
Also he revenged for his good brother. Yeah, I think he's the man.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we might do a separate discussion on sort of President Moon Jae-in, because he's a very interesting figure to talk about.
Yeah.
But this summit here, the Inter-Korean Summit, is significant in itself in that this is actually very similar to how Kim Yo-jong was very monumental for setting foot in South Korea. The meeting of the two leaders of the two Koreas wasn't something that happened since the end of the Korean War. So this was a very significant historical moment in Korean history for the Inter-Korean Summit to take place. How this actually happened? Well, you see here, Kim Yo-jong, she wasn't just here for nothing, right? She was here for business. She actually passed a note to President Moon Jae-in saying that, let's see, Kim Jong-un was actually Kim Jong-un was inviting President Moon to visit North Korea at his palace residence in order to have a conversation, in order to have a talk. And that's how the Inter-Korean Summit at Panmunjom actually took place, was because of the extension of the invitation at the Winter Olympics to have the two leaders meet together. Now, if you are looking at this from a very surface level, you're thinking to yourself, that's cool. It's really cool that North Korea is sort of showing a willingness to sort of have talks with South Korea. Well, this isn't it. And you guys probably know of this too, living in the United States, or actually being in the United States. Because all of that was actually done for this, the 2018 Singapore Summit between North Korea and the United States. See, when Kim Jong-un was thinking about a strategy, hey, what are some ways that I can boost my economy, despite the fact that we're a very closed export economy where traditional economics sort of doesn't work because we don't have a free market society? How do we sort of leverage sort of the peaceful, supposedly peaceful relationships that we now forge with South Korea to sort of extend that to the United States. And that's exactly what Kim Jong-un did in the 2018 Singapore summit, where during the meeting between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in, President Moon Jae-in, Kim Jong-un actually passed a note to President Moon Jae-in asking him to sort of pass along the invitation to President Trump to meet him at a summit later point in the future. And that's how this happened. That's how this Singapore summit in Singapore actually took place. All because of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, when Kim Yo-jong passed the note on to President Moon Jae-in, and President Moon Jae-in passed on the note to President Trump, which is the ultimate person that Kim Jong-un was actually striving for in order to have talks with, right? So you can already see just now, and this is only just scratching the surface of how Kim Jong-un was actually leveraged sort of South Korea as a broker in order to get into contacts with the United States. The important thing though is why? Why would they get into the contact with the United States? So I actually won't go into too much in depth about the summits because there were two that occurred between the two nations. But the basis for why these summits took place was obviously for negotiations. President Trump was obviously like, hey, hey Kim, I want you to completely denuclearize your peninsula. And Kim Jong-un would obviously be like, that's not possible, but we can denuclearize to some certain extent in exchange that you completely remove all economic sanctions to North Korea, right? And that's sort of how the Hanoi summit sort of fell apart, if you guys have been keeping up with the news, was because sort of the extreme demands on both sides for one on complete denuclearization and one complete elimination of economic sanctions, that sort of the deal broke off. But this was actually very significant because they met later at Panmunjom meeting, similar to President Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un at Panmunjom earlier in 2018. President Trump became the first US president to set foot in North Korea. So this was a pretty monumental moment in US history as well. And I included a little heart there to sort of symbolize the sentiment that sort of was prevalent during this time when the two leaders of the nations met together. But as luck would have it, in 2020, the October military parade. And of course, I sort of alluded to Tim Cook here, who's obviously the CEO of Apple, sort of how they release a new iPhone version every single year, and they talk about the next generation of the best iPhones. For North Korea, it's not iPhones, it's intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is, I think, Kojong 15 or 16, I'm not sure, but this is an intercontinental ballistic missile that is capable of striking any point in the United States, right? And so sort of what you see here is a full comeback of the cycle where North Korea would raise nuclear provocations. Then they would sort of play the friendly, charming card where, hey, let's have talks, let's have a discussion. Oh, by the way, can you remove some of that economic sanctions? And we promise to sort of denuclearize our state. And not even a year later, you see in the October military parade, Kim Jong-un is already showing off his new arsenal of nuclear weapons that his country has been developing. So what does that ultimately say? Actually, let me go to the video first. Let's have Kim Jong-un, explain it for himself. So this is a very short clip. Right. It's 2021 year. If you can pause the video. This was his 2021 New Year address, right? If you think about New Year address, this is sort of where all of the hopes and the dreams and the aspirations of what the country is going to look like into the future. And already beginning for 2021, Kim Jong-un's like, you know what? We need to do more to strengthen our nuclear arsenal because the US is our enemy. But then wasn't in 2019, you just talked about how President Trump was like your best friend. So what happened? North Korea has been playing this cycle since the very beginning, right? Where they're going to raise, nuclear provocations in order to get rid of some economic sanctions. And then let's see, so once those economic sanctions are taken down, some sort of another event like a nuclear testing happens where economic sanctions come back up, right? And then they play the same card where they're all charming and friendly and peace-loving, only to build nuclear weapons right after the economic sanctions are taken down. And I think Isha raised her hand. So Isha, can you speak up, please?
Yeah, I was just thinking perhaps it's because of the new administration that he's suddenly saying this. The new administration in the United States, that is. Like, maybe he knows that Biden will not be as, I don't know, diplomatic with him, if that's the right word.
Okay, so let's go back to the previous slide then. If your argument or the basis of your rationale was true, there would have been no reason for him to have performed an October military parade in 2020, where sort of the election results, which are in November, right? So October is a month before November, took place.
So perhaps he was able to see that Biden was going to win the next election. You know, there's a lot of stuff that maybe
right,
you can predict.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
Maybe he was just doing that in the anticipation of a regime change in America, because I know that North Korea-US relations have always been very tight in that aspect and a little bit strained. But then when Trump went into office, it was less so. At least in my eyes. Maybe I'm getting this all wrong.
No. You're good. You have a point, and something that I didn't actually plan on talking about in this presentation, but I actually am going to just briefly talk about now. Biden was the vice president of President Obama, obviously. Ex-President Obama also had a very hardline approach to North Korea, sort of the way that South Koreans perceive the difference between Obama and Trump was that Trump, at least on his part, tried to do something about the situation to negotiate at least a deal with North Korea to bring about denuclearization in the peninsula. And although I can't speak on the behalf of all Korean people, obviously, there are a portion of the Korean people who actually feel appreciative of at least Trump's effort to do something about the situation, contrary to President Obama, who really sort of didn't have the same sort of impact or the same degree of willingness to be able to sort of visit, North Korea directly in person. And since Joe Biden is Obama's vice president, I guess there could be speculations that Joe Biden will be similar to President Obama in those aspects.
Yeah, I think that Biden has also denounced Trump's handling of North Korea, and I think that's what I was mainly referring to, what you just said.
Exactly. But then the thing is that this all falls apart because of something called historical precedents. North Korea actually signed a non-proliferation treaty in 1994, but they immediately left the non-proliferation treaty in 2002 when they started proceeding with nuclear testings and the building of the hydrogen bomb. I think that was in 2016, and they also started building unveiled two new intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Hwasong 15, Hwasong, I think it was 14 and the 15 in 2017. So Isha, I agree with you. They probably sort of did this military parade as most countries do in order to show their strength and their power and their resilience. But North Korea has a cycle, and this is something that Korean analysts often talk about, is that there's this cycle where North Koreans would raise nuclear provocations when they feel like their economy is sort of tanking in order to sort of loosen economic sanctions on their country. And they do that by obviously showing a more charming, peaceful side of themselves. And the moment when it feels like the situation is time again for economic sanctions to be dropped, to say their economy is faltering, then they would sort of come back with these sort of military parades that you see here. And military parades are something that I saw growing up as a young child, watching South Korean news, seeing these military parades happening every 1 to 2 years or so. And so this is a cycle that North Korea has been playing all the time, sort of regardless of whether or not who is in power of the United States, because that's only just at the end of the day, a small part of it. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. I think that you put it in a lot better terms than I could understand, and that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, that's good. All right, and for everybody who's wondering when this presentation is going to end, it's ending pretty soon. I wanted to come ultimately to, let's see, to my final point. Actually, Jun, if you can pause the video, so allow me to skip to next. Wait, let's see.
What?
Okay,
What's this?
let's see. Can you go on to the next slide? So, for those of you who know your Disney movies, this is Beauty and the Beast. And everything that I just explained to Isha right now is sort of how the scene in Beauty and the Beast, where the Beast sort of allows Gaston to live, right? The moment he turns around, Gaston immediately, Gaston actually begged the Beast to let him live, and the Beast let him live. Then when the Beast turned his back, Gaston backstabbed him, right? So this is sort of how you can see a very basic Disney version of the dynamic between how North Korea and the US has been like, and sort of how, hey, we promised that we'll behave, no more nuclear testing. In fact, we abolished all of our nuclear producing factories. Look at us. Can you remove some economic sanctions? Okay, we'll remove the economic sanctions, but then why are you doing nuclear testing again, right? So it's the same sort of phenomenon that plays all the time in North Korea. And that's how the country has been able to survive until now, was because of nuclear weapons. And that's why it's so hard for denuclearization to happen in this peninsula. And apologies if this Disney snapshot sort of shocked you guys. But now I wanted to go to the question where, we can probably skip over the checklist because I basically covered a checklist. Will North and South Korea ever reunite? And if so, how? What do you guys think?
I think they will, and I hope that they do. How? I don't know. I wish I knew, but I don't know.
Okay.
I think the likelihood is extremely low.
Thank you, Kevin, for being realistic.
Excuse me?
Okay, so Jun, I'm 100% with you. As a fellow Korean, I want to see a day where North and South Korea reunite. But
They will.
okay.
I strongly believe that they do.
They will. As long as
they will, but it's gonna be a long time. They are both Korean people, so yeah. I think at the end they are gonna come together anyway. But right now, if you look at the current world politics, it's basically zero possibility.
Right.
Yeah.
And North and South Korea have evolved in separate ways for too long in order for sort of reunification to happen. Because now you have to think about which political government system are we going to employ? What about the differences in education, right? The educational gap that exists between the two nations, right? What are we going to do about employment? Because now, essentially, if reunification occurs, the South Korean government has to take care of, all of these North Koreans. So what's going to happen to the welfare of the South Koreans, right? So there are a lot of these factors that sort of make reunification very hard to happen, very difficult to happen. Isha unmuted herself, so I'm assuming Isha wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I think that is a little bit this ideologies in these countries. I who do want reunification about that would want a more democratic system, so to speak, than an authoritarian system. I think that they would want South Korea's methodology to be reflected in North Korea as well, if reunification did happen. So that answers the kind of if so how, but I don't think it's very likely.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, I think most people, most Korean analysts, or at least the ones that I see, agree that North and South Korea, for now, should continue to go on the path that they have continued to have been on in order for stability. And the fact of the matter is that North Korea is going to build a tremendous nuclear arsenal, right? But the fact of the matter is that to a certain point, once they have developed the nuclear weapons, the question remains, are they actually going to employ it? People know the moment that North Korea employs this nuclear arsenal, that's like a signal to the United States to immediately go after North Korea, right? And obviously there's going to be the dynamic with China, obviously, who's who's an important ally to North Korea, to sort of back North Korea in the case that a US invasion does occur. But the likelihood that North Korea will utilize this nuclear arsenal being very low, combined with the fact that the sort of existing status quo, as sort of unsatisfactory as they may be, sort of works for now, makes reunification a very, I don't want to say a non-urgent issue, but something that's not on any policymaker's horizon. But denuclearization is first before reunifications happen. All right, thank you, Anne, for coming in. Actually, I'm very close to finishing the slide. So actually, I want to talk about one last thing, which is North Koreans, overseas workers. My solution, right, if you really wanted to tackle the source of the problem, is we cut back on the overseas workers or North Koreans, because the North Korean currency is worthless. Nobody uses North Korean currency in the world, right, except for North Korea. So if we cut off the supply of foreign currency into North Korea, that allows it to build these sort of nuclear weapons, because they have to get these parts and these components from somewhere, right? So if you can somehow restrict the access of the flow of capital into North Korea, I think that's the best way to approach denuclearization. Let's see, let me go on to the next slide. So these are North Korean returners working home. This is the military balance between the two countries. And at the end of the day, it's the people, right? It has to come from within. Any change happening from North Korea cannot happen from outside. And I think most people probably know that nobody likes being told what to do. In the case for North Korea, if any change is going to happen, it has to come from within, like South Korea. South Korea went through a very long period of democracy, protest after protest after protest, to be able to live in the sort of country that it is today. And I think if North Koreans really want to see change in their country happening, they have to be the ones to step up to the plate and do something about it. And the biggest problem is that there's no flow of information into the country. So that makes it hard to happen. But this is the most viable solution that I'm seeing, right? And I'm gonna end the recording.